This week we are talking about the M in GSM blends. And in the tip of the week, are you a super taster? All of that coming up next. Hello and welcome to Wine This Week with Scott Leek. This week we are reviewing the varietal Mourvèdre, or also known as Monastrell, also known as Mataro. So depending on where you are, the name might be a little bit different. This is probably best known for being a component of the blends known as GSM blends, or Grenache, Syrah, and Mourvèdre. And this tends to originate in places like southern Rhone. All over southern France you find this grape planted, but it is planted at the multitude of 6 times more plantings in Spain than there are in France. So it is the second most planted grape in Spain behind Tempranillo. You can also find it in the US, particularly in California or Washington, and in Australia, where GSM blends are becoming more and more popular because of how much people like Southern Rhone wines. So the varietal itself isn't all that common as a single varietal. It is mostly found as blends. In Spain, however, it is pretty common to find this as a single varietal, and it is known as Monastrell there. Now, the grape tends to be very small, so small berries. They tend to get very thick skins, and they need really hot climates to ripen. So chances are you're going to have high sugar and thus high alcohol. They're very tannic. These are pretty big, bold wines, and this is what the grape brings to the GSM blend. It brings those components to it and provides a little balance with the Grenache and the Syrah. As a single varietal, though, we can expect this to be a pretty hearty, strong wine. And at $9.99, I'm really excited to give this a try. I think this could be a huge value play. It is pretty easy to find one from Spain, and it's pretty easy to find one. It's almost only found under $15 from what I could find here locally. Now, the particular producer that I picked for this is a very famous family out of Spain known as Juan Gil. It is specifically called the Venus Familia Gil family estates. This comes from the region Jumilla. It's Jumilla. Jumilla is probably the most common place you're going to find Monastrell in Spain, but it does grow in a couple of different regions, and I'm excited to give this one a try. Let's get to it. Today's wine is a Monastrell made by Mourvèdre. These are organic grapes. It is a 2019 vintage, and because of how tannic and bold that I'm expecting this to be, this is a little bit of a gamble having a 2019, having it so young. And if you noticed, I've had this thing open since the start of filming this entire segment. I'm a little nervous, maybe should have decanted this. I'm expecting it to be pretty big. I'm gonna let this even aerate a little before I even smell it. But on the color, this is dark. I mean, I can barely see through the wine to see the paper here, but very dark. It's a nice, I'm almost gonna call it inky, but it's got a little bit more of a red than that kind of purple hue. So I'm gonna call this just a deep garnet, medium garnet, and let's give it a smell. It's pretty jammy, and I can smell some of that alcohol. I think this is at 14 or 14 and a half, and 14 and a half. That is pretty common for this varietal. Every bottle I looked at in the store was at least 14%. So I don't know that this is oaked. I couldn't find any information to suggest that it was. The grape does handle oak well, so I'm assuming there is some in this. But it's definitely dark fruits, maybe some dark cherry. There's a little, maybe even sour cherry. Just black fruits, dark plum. There is, man, just the alcohol is really coming through. I really should have decanted this, but we're gonna power through. So there are some spices and maybe some herbs coming through. I'm not able to pinpoint it. And there's almost this meatiness to it, like almost like I'm smelling a stew or maybe even raw meat. All right, we're gonna give this a taste. Okay. This is tannic. Let's start with some of the basics. So this is, I'm gonna go off dry, and the alcohol is pretty high on this. Again, these are small, tight berries with thick skin. Sugar can get pretty high. There might be a little residual sugar here, so I'm going off dry. This has just a little bit of sweetness to it, but it could just be because the fruit is pretty jammy. The acid level, not quite as high as I thought it was going to be. I'm going to call medium plus on the acid. And then, yeah, definitely that tannin. This is high tannin. I just kind of felt overall drying in my mouth, cheeks, and tongue. Yeah, the acidity and the tannins are actually fairly well balanced together. Alcohol is high. It's not off-putting, but 14.5 is definitely coming through. This is high alcohol. And the body is nice. Like, one of the first things I noticed when I took a sip of this was the weight in my mouth. This felt heavy. And I say that in a good way. Great weight to it. Because if it had all those other things but didn't have the heft, the weight to it, it would have felt imbalanced. So far, pretty impressed with this at less than $10. So the intensity of the aromas is kind of on the pronounced side. While I'm struggling to pinpoint very specific things, like I said, there is dark fruit there, maybe a little dark cherry, dark plum, and some spices that I can't quite pinpoint. A hint of maybe some tobacco or cedar, which could be from some oak influence. And I'm getting all those same things on the palate as well. This is a good wine, and again, I think this is a good value. So if you're the type of person that really goes for big, bold wines and you don't want to spend too much on it, at $10, like, I would probably rather have a $10 Monastrell than maybe a $10 Cabernet. So far, I'm giving this a pretty good scoring here. I'm gonna say the balance is really nice. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good balance with everything that's going on there. The length on the finish is average. I'll give it a 20-second count on the finish. The intensity of the flavors is pretty good. Not overly complex, but good intensity to the flavors. And I think this is going to go great with food, as it's hard to have a tannic wine without food, in my opinion. But this has got a lot going for it. So on my 10-point scale, I'm going to give this 6.5 points. It's pretty impressive, particularly at this price point. So in the QPR category, quality to price ratio, this is impressive. This gets good marks. And as far as the food and wine pairing go, and granted, I did a lot of research on this ahead of time to kind of know what would be good with this. I'm filming this on the 4th of July. I've got some ribs on the smoker that have been there for almost 5 hours now. So in about an hour, as this wine is a little more opened up and mellowed, this should be great with barbecued ribs. I think this will go well with, I made a comment, there was kind of like a meatiness on it. So a meaty stew might be good if you're kind of having this in the wintertime. But this would certainly do well with a steak or a lot of other big, bold, anything you would have a Cabernet with, I would have this Monastrell with as well. So good value play. Seek one out if you've not had this before. And certainly if you've had GSM blends and you like those, you might have an indication that some of those bigger, bolder components of that wine are going to be amplified if you have a single varietal. I received a comment from someone recently saying, hey, I really enjoy the video, Scott, but to me, red wine just kind of tastes like red wine. And that's okay. It could be that maybe that person's predisposed to not be able to detect all the different nuances that I often talk about in these videos. It could be that they just need a little practice in training and honing their palate, which is part of why I'm doing these videos as well. There's a category of taster known as a super taster or a highly sensitive taster. So there are three main categories that we can break people down into from a taste bud standpoint. So much like with our vision, you might be nearsighted or farsighted, or maybe you got 20/20 vision. In the very same way, our taste buds can be measured and broken down into super tasters, tasters, or what's known as a tolerant taster. Depending on the literature, it might fall in those three categories. They might refer to it as highly sensitive, sensitive, or non-sensitive. So depending on the literature, the three kind of tiers are essentially the same. And in the top tier, those hypersensitive or those super tasters, they represent about 25% of the population, and they are twice as likely to be female. The average taster, which tends to be a little bit more often males, they can detect a lot of different things, but maybe takes a little bit more work. That's the category I fall in, again, why I'm doing these videos. And I will do a future video on how to actually train your palate, how to detect more things in wine, but we'll save that for a later date. Now, how do you know which one you are? Well, if you're a super taster, there might be a couple of easy giveaways. Number one, you probably do not like bitter things, whether it's bitter wine or like a bitter IPA beer, or even just straight black coffee. Brussels sprouts, kale, those are all bitter foods and drinks. They're probably a little too much for you. If you are a hypersensitive taster and you like coffee, good chance you've got sugar and cream in it. And you might be predisposed to prefer sugar a little bit more as well. Now, someone like myself who's just an average taster, the nice thing for me is I kind of like everything. You know, my wife probably is a hypersensitive or a super taster. She can detect things in wines way faster and more easily than I can. For me, as you've seen in a lot of the videos, I'm smelling and tasting and smelling and tasting because it takes a lot of work for me to pull some of these things out and detect, all right, is this blueberry or blackberry I'm smelling today? So for a super taster though, those come really quickly and easily, but it comes at the expense of not liking some of these things, which is why another thing that they found in scientific studies, super tasters tend to be a little bit more fit and healthy because they're unlikely to like processed foods, highly salty foods, things that just aren't as good for us. So those are some things that might help you determine whether you're a super taster or an average taster. If you are a non-taster, as they say, or slightly insensitive taster, chances are you love highly tannic wines. You love wines with a little bitterness to them. You don't really like super sweet wines. You might like wines that are really bold. Wines that have high alcohol are probably right up your alley as well. So those are some ways to kind of detect where you're at on the spectrum. Now, why does this matter? Well, first of all, I want to just impress upon you that this is something you're predisposed to. It might be in your genes. There are some cultural and environmental and societal factors that go into our ability to taste and experience as part of it as well. But this has been found to be a dominant gene. So if you are a hypersensitive or a super taster, there is a very, very good chance at least one of your parents is as well. Secondly, you can train your palate. If you think back to the first time you ever had a beer, you probably thought it was bitter, no matter whether you are a super taster or a non-taster. And if you were 8 years old or if you were 21, it doesn't matter. You probably thought that Miller Lite was a bitter beer. And today, maybe you love IPAs and you can actually do the bitter beers. So this is something that you can train, you can work on, and you can learn to like things or even love things that maybe you weren't predisposed to. It just takes a little bit of practice and effort. The third thing and most important thing of why I'm bringing this all up is because the average sommelier, I shouldn't say the average, but a sommelier, a wine critic, someone working in a wine store, those people are more likely to be drawn to that profession and be good at it because they are super tasters. Not necessarily all sommeliers are super tasters, but they're more likely to be. So I want you to keep that in mind that if you are not, and you're relying on wine reviews and the expert opinions, you're relying on someone whose palate is very different from yours, not just because of what they like or what they don't like, but actually genetically, you might have very different palates and you might be predisposed to tasting things differently than those people do. So what I recommend is when you are with the sommelier, when you're at a wine store working with a wine merchant, talk a little bit more about the different things in your palate. Talk about whether you drink your coffee black or with sugar. Talk about whether or not you like high tannin wines or high alcohol wines, or if you're a super taster, you probably like a little bit more delicate and nuanced wine. Talk about that a little bit. That will help them guide you to a wine that is better suited for your palate than what the experts might say. Thank you for watching another episode of Wine This Week. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please like and subscribe. Join me next week as we move on to a fun varietal known as Mourvèdre. Until then, keep trying new wines, and as always, cheers.